Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with a discussion about my Ogre unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. In this video I'm going to go over the generic units of the Ogres, not regiments renowned, not heroes, not lords. Let's start with the humble Gnoblars, F tier unit, easily an F tier unit. Some people do argue in favor of them, but here's my perspective on Ogres. Very early on in a campaign, there's flat out better units, even better Gnoblar units available in your campaign pretty quickly. Then later on in a campaign, all Gnoblar units become useless. There is some reason to recruit some Gnoblar units very early on for a specific capability that Ogres do lack, specifically their anti-large situation, which can only be resolved with either cavalry or with some very heavy infantry later on in the campaign. But even by that standard, Gnoblars are just a really weak, useless unit. They're cheap, to be sure, but they don't have any kind of combat capability, and consider the Ogre army. Ogres are the Ogres themselves have units with few entities in them. But that actually works to their benefit, because if you're dealing with mass range firepower, just blob them up, charge a section of the enemy army so that their range units suddenly become useless. Or spread them apart to interact with the different enemy portions of the enemy army to prevent their range units from really playing a role from that perspective. Blobbing them up also helps them out with various effects that happen on a radius, certain spells. So Gnoblars are not really going to work with the Ogre heroes. They're not overall going to work with the Ogre playstyle, from my point of view. They're basically the Ogre equivalent of Skaven slaves in a lot of different ways, and that is probably very fitting in the lore. There might be some situations where you might recruit a couple of them, but even then, if you can recruit Gnoblars, you just flat have better options, even if you don't have a barracks in a settlement. Then we have Gnoblar Flingers. I'd say Gnoblar Flingers, the newly introduced unit for the Ogres, are D tier. Not especially useful as Skaven slaves with slings, but Ogres can lack some range capability, and these guys provide, in as much as Gnoblars can provide anything in an Ogre army, they provide some kind of range capability, decent enough range capability, very early on in a campaign. Just very early on. Limited use during the course of a campaign. From my perspective, you'd only really use them at the beginning of a campaign, if at all. It depends on what you're dealing with, what you need to deal with. So from that perspective, I personally just don't bother recruiting them. I don't think they're worth it. Because you got to consider something about Ogres. Ogres can focus early on getting heroes, can focus early on leveling up their camps very quickly. So Ogres can get to tier 4, tier 5 very quickly with their camps, and then have access to that unit recruitment. Now, of course, you then run into the issues, not necessarily of cost, because Ogres can have a lot of money, but how long it takes to recruit units. But even by that perspective, Gnoblar Flingers, I understand the value they have, but I just don't think they're a really good campaign unit. Unlike Pigback Riders. See, Pigback Riders, they would generally be also a D tier. I wouldn't quite put them in F tier, but the capability they provide is something that can be difficult to replace for Ogres. Basically, you won't have a replacement for these guys for the role they provide in an army until tier 4. And at tier 4, you might have other priorities of recruitment. Now, Pigback Riders, what they're good at is anti-large. So their flank protection, especially for your artillery units, for range units, for artillery units, for lead belchers, they can provide that kind of flank protection. And Ogres, weirdly enough, actually are lacking severely in terms of anti-large capability. So Pigback Riders do provide that kind of anti-large capability to protect your precious artillery pieces, which can otherwise be vulnerable to cavalry attacks on your flanks while the mass of your Ogres is going in to engage. But even then, I wouldn't put them higher. I know some people, make entire armies centered around these guys, but I don't think they're useful outside of that specific role, if even necessarily that, to be quite honest. There are situations where you might use them. They do provide they are a useful tool for an army, but to a limited extent, and later on you do have ways of replacing them that are just flat out better in quite a lot of ways in terms of dealing with enemy cavalry, in terms of providing you that flank protection, but they're decently durable. They have a pretty solid amount of leadership as far as these units go. Like, that's one of the things about Gnoblar Flingers and regular Gnoblars. Their leadership is pretty rubbish. These guys do have that kind of leadership benefit, provided their HP is high enough. You obviously don't want to throw them into the middle of an army, though you could. They do two things. One, they can protect you against cavalry. Two, if the enemy has masses of anti-large units, then you could throw these guys against those large anti-large units to distract them while your ogres do flank attack. So they're a decent enough line holder in those kind of situations. Later on, you just flat out don't care about them. Then Gnoblar Trappers, yeah, I'm going to put Gnoblar Trappers as an F tier unit. Especially since Gnoblar Flingers have been added in, I just really don't see the value of it. Like, they're a bad skirmishing unit with limited range, not the greatest damage, not great stats overall. I don't see a value in recruiting these guys whatsoever during the course of a campaign. Then we have Ogre Bulls. Ogre Bulls, D tier unit. Like, if you literally have nothing else to recruit during a campaign, during a turn, you will recruit these guys, right? That is the only reason you would bother recruiting Ogre Bulls. Outside of that, completely useless unit in more ways than one. Like, there's Ogre Bulls just lack damage, the durability, the capability in combat of other units. But they're still ogres. They can still do ogre charges, so they're useful from that perspective. But outside of that, they're just basically an emergency recruitment situation when you're lacking recruitment options and you just want to fill up an army. That is the only value that Ogre Bulls have during the course of a Warhammer free campaign as any of the Ogre Legendary Lords. Then we have Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. I'm going to put these guys as, I'm going to say A tier unit, in the sense that while obviously they lack longevity in a campaign, early on when you're playing an Ogre campaign and you start, and when you replace with tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 units, until you get to that point, you might just benefit from mass recruiting them. They do have a bonus versus infantry, they're pretty solid in melee. Like, unlike regular Ogre Bulls, they're just flat out better melee units. They are very easy to recruit in a campaign. They're not very expensive. There's no reason to recruit Ogre Bulls when you have Ogre Bulls with dual weapons. Just that kind of situation during the course of a campaign. Like, obviously, you do replace them later on, but these are the mainstay early game unit from my perspective from the Ogres. Not the best unit, sure. They're not necessarily the most exciting unit, but they do get the job done. As long as you get the job done, that's all that matters. Then we have Ogre Bulls with Ironfists. So, Iron Fists in general, Iron Fist units in general, I don't really have a great opinion of Iron Fist weapons. The reason for that, from my perspective, is that what is the value of an Iron Fist weapon? Well, it's going to help you out against range attacks, right? With giving you a bronze shield. Okay, fair enough. But given Ogre mobility, and the ability of Ogre charges, and the way ranged units work, and the kind of enemies you're dealing with early on in a campaign, I don't really see much of a reason to bother with Iron Fists. Even if you were to pick a fight with Cafe, I mean, regular Ogre Bulls will decimate an Empire range line early on, but let's say you're picking a fight with Wood Elves, you're picking a fight with High Elves, even then, their kind of durability that they provide against ranged weaponry is not worth it, especially because you're going to close the gap anyway against any kind of range faction. There's very few range factions that can deal with Ogre Bulls with dual weapons early on and prevent them from just getting stuck in melee and just nullifying any kind of benefit ranged weapons have. I mean, if you do want a unit to soak some range fire, sure, I guess they can be a bit useful from that perspective, but most of the time I just don't think they're worth recruiting. In fact, I'm just going to put them D tier. Then we have Lead Belchers, S tier unit, very easy S tier. Now, one shouldn't consider these guys as a regular cannon or a regular artillery unit. They're not. What they really are is the principal ogre ranged weapon on the battlefield. They're great against masses of units. They're obviously not great in artillery duels. They're not great against ranged units. They're not great against single entities. Keep that aspect in mind when you're talking about lead belchers. Lead belchers are not designed to deal with single entities or large units in general. That is the role of other units in your roster that you do have access to. So they're great against masses of units, especially cheap units. They will do a truckload of damage, and even if the enemy flanks them, well, okay, you flanked with Cavalry a unit of lead belchers. Good luck winning that particular engagement. So they're good range damage dealers, and that's how you should treat them. Not necessarily as an artillery unit, but more like the ogre version of grudge rakers, if you will, from the dwarves, or blunderbusses from the cast dwarves. That's probably the best way to view lead belchers, but really, really solid range unit. Decently durable, decently capable of fending off for themselves in melee, but really great against masses of units. Then we have scrap launchers. I think scrap launchers, they're kind of B-tier unit. They're not horrible. They get the job done. They're good against masses of units, but yeah, you have lead belchers for that. Though obviously scrap launchers, one, do a lot more damage from that perspective. They're obviously a proper artillery unit. Consider scrap launchers kind of like a grudge thrower from the dwarves, and that's how you should treat them. They're good in that context as an artillery unit. They are available at tier 3. They can be recruited from regular settlements, so there's a bunch of different benefits. Like, in point of fact, I would argue this is the most useful Gnoblar unit, because it is technically a Gnoblar unit that you get with these guys. A Gnoblar unit using a dwarf grudge throwers. Yeah, I know, a weird comparison right there, but I think that is perhaps the best comparison. Obviously, grudge throwers have some benefits in artillery duels, so they're not necessarily great against other artillery, but ogres have options with respect to that. Then we have iron blasters. I'm going to put these guys as an A-tier unit. The amount of damage an iron blaster can do, this is a proper cannon unit. Bit high tier, to be sure, so that's one of the reasons that I'm not going to put them higher, because the question of availability does matter. Sure, lead belchers can take multiple turns to recruit, to be sure, but they don't require the same kind of tier that iron blasters do. Like, lead belchers are available from regular settlements and camps. Iron blasters do have that problem, a bit of recruitment, but the amount of damage they can do is certainly very, very, very useful on a battlefield. Not necessarily the prime range unit of the ogres or the best artillery unit of the ogres, but they do get the job done. Or, generally speaking, it's not one of the best artillery units, but it's kind of like the equivalent of a cast dwarf artillery unit, if you will, to an extent, with all the limitations that come from an artillery unit like that. The one reason I'm not going to put them in S tier is also the fact to do with the ogre playstyle. Like, there's different playstyles available to the ogres. I personally prefer going with the combined arms approach, so like lead belchers, artillery, and obviously regular ogres to do those charges, but there's an strong argument to be made in favor of a pure melee ogre army, and it can get the job done. But you're not gonna suffer from going with iron blasters in a campaign. Saber tusks, F tier unit, fly out now war for recruiting. Like, if you're looking for fast moving units of the ogres, there's better choices. If you're looking for a flanking unit of the ogres, there's better choices. If you're looking for a cheap unit that you can dispose of, there's better choices. So I really don't see a reason for recruiting Saber Tusks at any point in a campaign. They die very quickly. They don't do a great damage. Yes, I know hunters can give them a bunch of benefits, but seriously, of all the things you want to recruit that in terms of monsters for the ogres, this is what you're going to go for? Like, yeah, I would never bother with these guys. Then we have vultures. I think vultures are a C tier unit. They're not great in combat. Far from it. They're actually pretty bad in combat. But One shouldn't underestimate the kind of flexibility it gives you in a battlefield to have a flying unit that can swoop in and disable enemy range units. In that kind of context where you're dealing with range units and you're considering, okay, how am I going to solve the line? Just flying some of these vultures around, disabling the enemy artillery, even if they all die, fair enough. You know, they're cheap, they're easy to recruit. Very good. This is one of the reasons saber tusks are not worth a damn. Because, the role that saber tusks have on a battlefield is the role vultures have in a battle. And vultures are just better at it because, obviously, they're a flying unit. So they have a bunch more battlefield flexibility than saber tusks do have. Then we have giants. Ogre giants. Yeah, I think ogre giants are just a worthless unit, flat out a worthless unit. Like, if you're looking for big single smashy entities, Stonehorns exist. They're better, flat out better than giants. Like, giants are slow, they can do a decent amount of damage, but they're just not great in a combat situation. Giants have always been a questionable unit in Total War Warhammer from the very beginning of Total War Warhammer. And I think the Ogre Giants, considering the roster that they have, like, think of an ogre army, right? You have a big melee blob that's going to charge, like if you go with that melee focus, you have a big melee blob of ogres that's going to charge into the middle of the enemy forces. But the benefit of ogres in doing so, ogre bulls, iron guts, man-eaters, you name it, gorgers, yetis, the benefit in that is it's difficult for enemy range units to target you when you do that. Giants, big target, big guy, very easy to take down, not really that resistant in melee. Like, I think the only faction that really makes good use of giants is Festus. I'm not joking on that. Like, Festus can make giants feel worth recruiting because he gives them that kind of durability and healing. Ogres do obviously have healing and a bunch of buffs, but even then, it's nullifying some of the benefits that ogres do have in combat. Iron Guts, in as far as units go, like, I think Iron Guts are an A tier unit. I wouldn't quite put them S tier because I think you would replace them later on, but they're fairly durable combatants. They are ogres. Like, they're effectively ogre bulls with two-handed weapons. So, good amount of damage in theory. In practice, I do find myself always disappointed by the kind of damage Iron Guts do have in battle. But they are capable of doing a decent amount of damage. They're decent enough in terms of survivability and all the benefits that a big hulking ogre has in battle. So yeah, Iron Guts, when you get to tier 3, they're worth recruiting. In fact, making entire armies of these guys is absolutely worth doing during the course of the campaign. Man-eaters, regular man-eaters, not the variants of man-eaters, just regular versions. Not worth it at all, in any way, shape, or form. Like, other versions of man-eaters, absolutely, right? Options of man-eaters. And I guess, I put the regiment around there. My mistake. But regular man-eaters, they don't have the durability of Iron Guts. They're not necessarily going to do a great deal of damage in battle either. I don't really see a value in recruiting them in the first place. I would even consider putting them in F tier, really, to be quite honest on that subject. But then we have the man-eaters with ogre pistols. Now, these guys are an S tier unit, or at least an A tier unit. I think they really are an S tier unit. One should underestimate that kind of pistol capability, especially when watching man-eaters with ogre pistols moving around the battlefield, shooting at guys while they're moving, devastating enemy flanks, and then closing in melee. Like, they have roughly the same combat capability as regular man-eaters, but that range capability they provide is certainly significant enough. Maybe an A tier, not quite an S tier. They're not necessarily that exceptional. But still, they're a really solid unit, worth recruiting, worth using in your armies, though, of course, tier requirements, costs, duration of recruitment, all that kind of stuff. Man-eaters with Iron Guts, they do gain increased durability, but yeah, I think that they're just flat out worth recruiting. Like, if you want a more durable melee unit, there's better choices from that perspective. Like, I don't think Iron Fist units in general are just worth recruiting in an Ogre campaign. Not useless. They can be considered better than regular man-eaters, but yeah, just questionable value in recruiting them because of the Ogre playstyle from that perspective. Maneaters with two-handed weapons, now that's a different discussion. Now, here, this is an S tier unit, for multiple reasons actually. One, not only are they great in melee, but they're good against Cav, because they have an anti-large benefit. See, this is one of the problems I mentioned about Ogres. They are actually lacking in terms of anti-large benefits, until you get Maneaters with two-handed weapons. That is the role they fill in an Ogre army. They're good against infantry, but their principal role in recruiting them in an Ogre campaign is not necessarily to deal with infantry, it's to deal with enemy cavalry, or to deal with big, large, single entities. Your artillery may struggle in that respect. Lead belchers, as I mentioned, are not for that particular purpose. So if you're looking to kill a lord that's on a big mount, a dragon, or even a horse, these guys are great for it. If you're looking to protect your units from cavalry attacks, these guys are for it. Just overall a great unit that's absolutely worth recruiting during the course of a campaign. Then we have Maneaters with dual weapons. Like, yes, they're Golg's Maneaters, but really, they're just Maneaters with dual weapons. They do have some significant combat benefits compared to other Maneaters, but they're infantry destroyers. Like, when you're dealing with infantry, you don't necessarily want Maneaters with two-handed weapons, though they can certainly do the job. You want Maneaters with dual weapons, that anti-infantry benefit. They're also the most durable of the Maneater units. Annabelle is a really, really good unit, really solid, absolutely worth recruiting. High damage, pretty good durability. I think Iron Guts are more durable, but overall these are one of the most durable Ogre units that you have available. And just very, very good in combat against infantry. And again, because of the way Ogres work in battle against enemy range units and all that, like just throw them in the middle of an enemy army and they'll just kill everything in sight. Unless it's big single entities, that's why you bring Maneaters with two-handed weapons. Gorgers. Gorgers are an S tier unit, and that is not really an argument from my point of view. Like, when you're looking at Gorgers, think of this. Gorgers are extreme damage healers. Like, the amount of, like, I don't fear a lot of Ogre units when I'm fighting them, right? The one thing, because there are ways to counter them, hard ways to counter them, right? So you can form up your line in such a way or target them with missile units if you're fighting them. Obviously, if you're fighting Ogres, you will use tactics that the AI isn't going to use. But the one unit I fear when I'm dealing with Ogres are freaking Gorgers. They're unbreakable. They do an enormous amount of damage on the battlefield. And then, while all Ogre units are fast, these guys are the scariest to encounter on a battle because you know they will not break. You know that you probably won't kill them before they engage your melee lines. They can even sneak up on you. And once they do engage in melee, they're going to tear your units apart in a way, with a speed that no other Ogre unit has. They're not as durable as other units. Sure, that is their weakness, but their sheer amount of damage kind of makes up for it. So glass cannon type unit, absolutely, but very, very good unit all the same for the Ogres to get during the course of a campaign. Then we have Yetis. So Yetis, the way I would view Yetis, they're kind of like Gorgers in a sense. They kind of have the same role, but whereas Gorgers are extreme damage dealer at the cost of all survivability, Yetis are more of a support damage dealer. They slow down units, they have magical attacks, so they're good against demons. They're also more durable than Gorgers. They won't last, they can break, so they don't have that unbreakable trait. So that is a weakness that they do have in battles. But all the same, they do fill a role, and they do fill that role very well in terms of dealing with enemies that have a high amount of physical resistance, or just enemies that, you know, require magical weapons to deal with during the course of a battle. A really solid unit that is almost always recruiting, not necessarily in high numbers. You don't necessarily want to mass Yetis, but their ability of slowing down enemies and their ability of dealing with things that require magical attacks makes them an exceptionally useful unit to recruit during the course of a campaign. Then we have Mournfang Cavalry. Not a bad unit. far from it. Pretty solid, gets the job done. No complaints on that subject. It's just they're kind of least interesting cavalry unit that the ogres have. Like, you look at the other cavalry units, the 4 other cavalry units. I'm not going to say that they're not worth recruiting, but there's just better options. They're monstrous cavalry units that do pretty decently in melee, but still, just there's better options. Like, literally every other ogre cavalry unit is worth recruiting more. Even the Iron Fist version, which weirdly enough has this icon. Don't ask me on that. You can ask Creative Assembly on that subject. But while with infantry, with ogre infantry, it may not be worth recruiting units with Iron Fist because, again, ogre melee tactics get in there. Obviously, when you run them out, the dynamic changes a bit, and making cavalry more resistant to range attacks can be a bit more useful. Though, truthfully, the reason I'm putting them higher is because Mornfang cavalry is worth recruiting. It's just like, this is a Morn cavalry unit that's better at resisting range attacks, so of course it's just a better unit in general. But the really good, best version of the Mornfang cavalry is obviously the one with two-handed weapons. And if you were to look at these icons compared to, other icons, like you look at these guys, you look at these guys, and then you see this guy, it's like, that's the two-handed version? Yes, that is the two-handed version of the Mornfang cavalry. So obviously, great weapon variant of the Mornfang cavalry, really solid overall, like just better at dealing with enemy cavalry, better at dealing with melee, extremely powerful unit. I would put them higher, but there is always that but of the fact that between recruiting Mornfang cavalry, like if you're looking at a Mornfang cavalry unit and asking yourself, is this worth recruiting? I mean, yes, kind of, but then you also have crushers to talk about, and you can't ignore that dynamic that ogres can get their camps to a very high level very quickly. By the time you even get the cavalry building, you might have access to the higher tier. And so it might be worth just skipping Mornfang cavalry in general and going for crushers during the course of a campaign while recruiting other units in the meantime. With respect to crushers, we have 2 versions. One with the Iron Fist weapon, which, yes, I know, it might look like a two-handed weapon, but yes, this is the Iron Fist version. Fairly durable for a cavalry, really durable actually for a cavalry, really scary to deal with on the battlefield, and decently resistant against missile ranged attacks, if you have a problem with that. But then we have crushers with gray weapons. These things are genuinely one of the scariest fucking units to face in a campaign. Like, imagine a Gorger with far more durability and anti-large benefit, and you kind of get crushers with gray weapons. They will defeat cavalry. I don't think any cavalry in the game can outright defeat these guys. Like, I'm struggling. Like, maybe some corn cavalry? Maybe. And I emphasize the maybe aspect on that subject. But if we're already talking about blood crushers, then you've got a really, really good unit on your hands over here with these guys. Just insane level of stats. Don't have that or that missile resistance that Iron Fists have, but they more than make up for it against enemy cavalry. So there are reasons to recruit the version with Iron Fist if you're dealing with masters of range units, but if you're dealing with powerful melee factions, yeah, just go crushers with gray weapons. They will do a better job. Then we have Stonehorns. Now, Stonehorns are everything the fucking giants wish they were. See, when you have a big single entity, you kind of want it to, one, both do a lot of damage, have a lot of mass, and resist a lot of freaking damage. Giants wish they could do that. Stonehorns actually do that. Like, they're very durable in a fight. They're good at surviving mass range fire. And they're just flat out freaking scary in the middle of an enemy army. The sole reason that they're not an S tier unit is because the ogres are complete fucking maniacs who decided, oh, let's take the giant beastie and put an artillery piece on it. And thus you get the Stonehorn with the harpoon launcher. Effectively the same unit with an artillery piece on top of it. Freaking madness. That is the reason you recruit Stonehorns with harpoon launchers. And another thing to also mention about Stonehorns and Stonehorns with harpoon launchers, you might argue that they're a high tier unit. They're not really a high tier unit, because exotic animals can provide you recruitment of both Stonehorn versions at tier 3. Now chew on that for a moment. Creative Assembly considers this a tier 3 unit in a campaign. Okay, I'm bullshitting. It's resource that's not necessarily the easiest to acquire in many ways, can be a bit annoying to be sure, but it is fucking nuts to consider just the sheer capability. And then we have finally Thunder Tusks, S tier unit as well. Now they don't have the same kind of capability in combat as Stonehorns do. They're not necessarily as good in combat, but they do have magical attacks and they do slow down enemies. So if you want a big ass unit with range capability on top of it, so basically if a Stonehorn is like the single entity version of a Gorger with the durability of Iron Gut, then the Thunder Tusks are the version of the Yetis. Not quite as durable as Stonehorns though, but they do slow down enemies, they do have range attacks, and they still pack a hell of a punch. Freaking scary units. You know, looking at this list, you always wonder why Ogres did so poorly in multiplayer. It is a question of cost, right? Because multiplayer has that particular situation. Also, Ogres can be hard countered, unlike when you're dealing with AI. So there are hard counters to deal with respect to Ogres, but that's the situation of the Ogre unit roster. So Lead Belchers, the higher tier Maneater versions, the Gorgers, the Crushers with Grey Weapons, Stonehorns, and Thunder Tusks S tier. Like, everything above B is absolutely worth recruiting in a campaign en masse, not just a couple of them en masse. B and C are situational. D and F you should probably avoid. That would be my perspective on the subject of the Ogre unit roster. Cosine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.